Three, two, one. All right, it's Filecoin time. Hello, everyone. My name is Mihai. I run protocol research at Messari, and I'm very happy to have today with me Clara and John. Clara, how about you start introducing yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I know we're reaching the sleepy time in the afternoon, so thank you for being with us. I know that there's also a happy hour going on. My name is Clara Tao. I'm the founding officer of the Filecoin Foundation, and we look at long term governance of the Filecoin network. So we're very similar to the Ethereum Foundation and in the open source world, like the Linux Foundation, where we give the majority of ecosystem grants, and we also look at security and governance to make sure that Filecoin can be healthy, robust, and be able to work in a way that supports decentralized storage.
Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan Victor, and I'm the co-founder of Onsa Research. We're an R&D firm that focuses specifically on decentralization of the cloud. Lots of our time is spent in the Filecoin ecosystem. We work with teams that are building, basically connect them with builders, fundraise, things of that nature. We've been working on decentralized storage for like the last 5.5 years. So excited to be in this conversation today.
Yeah, so for several years now, I've been covering myself Filecoin in several reports, specifically on quarterly reports that we put together, and where we look at metrics around revenue, staking, decentralization, ecosystem growth, and also adoption. And Filecoin has been at the forefront of decentralized storage. So a question for you, John, to start with. Can you give us a brief of where Filecoin is today when it comes to decentralized storage, but also some other services that you guys have in store?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to think about Filecoin is as sort of like a platform where there's many other components that are being built on top. So Filecoin, when it launched, the main thing it was doing was sort of this verifiable archival of storage where you could prove that there was certain data that was on the network using snarks. And so part of what made that interesting is you could actually build internet scale infrastructure that's verifiable using a blockchain. That sounds potentially trivial or maybe not something that like truly resonates. But if you talk to anyone who's like working on any large scale system, like building things that can operate at like petabyte to exabyte scale and having that be verifiable on a blockchain sounds somewhat insane. And to be fair, it is kind of insane. I think the thing that's been interesting in the last, call it like year and some change, is sort of the expansions that the Filecoin ecosystem has had. Last year marked the launch of the FVM. This allowed for programmability on top of the Filecoin network, which meant you could start doing more interesting things like building like DeFi primitives to link like capital flows with the actual like storage flows and the businesses in the Filecoin economy. Teams like Glyph have built lending as an example that's already gotten to tens of millions of TVL sitting on top of the Filecoin network. On top of that, there's been more innovations as Filecoin has marched further downstream into other adjacent businesses, things like hot storage layers. There's teams now that are building L2s for basically like S3-like experiences, teams building on-chain data lakes, teams that are looking at compute protocols. So taking basically the hardware of the Filecoin network and expanding the service set that Filecoin as an ecosystem can provide to the rest of the world.
Right. So I noticed that over the years, Filecoin has been concentrated, has been focused mostly on growing the supply side, so the storage provider side, growing the capacity of the network, and then after several years, there was like a sustained push towards increasing the demand for Filecoin through deals, through actually onboarding storage deals. How would you commend the current status when it comes to where the network is at on the supply side versus where the demand is? Clara, what do you think?
You're absolutely right. In the early days of a decentralized storage network and in the early days of Filecoin, we really focused on building a huge network of storage providers. These are entrepreneurs all around the world running small to large data centers. And through that process, there's around 501 exabytes of available storage on the network. However, one thing that we're really focused on right now this year and also the last year or so is really building up clients that are storing data on Filecoin and also turning those clients to paid users so that we can really be an economy with a robust marketplace for storage. And so to date, we have around 2,000 clients storing data on Filecoin, and actually 518 of those are over 1,000 terabytes. And so these are huge data sets, and a lot of these clients might include research institutions like UC Berkeley. They might include large-scale institutes like CERN, for example, where the internet was invented. We also have been working with different groups like MIT Open Learning to really back up open coursework. And one key focus this year is also looking at enterprise adoption. So around a year and a half ago, we launched a decentralized storage alliance to bring together a number of enterprise companies really looking at decentralized storage adoption and really getting the roadmap ready for things like SOC 2 compliance and making sure that as we're building this marketplace, we can build to different use cases. A big theme of this year is it's really been deep in summer, and also a lot of AI is a buzzword. And that's also an area we're also making sure that we fold into thinking about use cases for Filecoin. So in Brussels, just a few months ago, we launched around 7 different partnerships with different AI agents that are looking at Filecoin as that storage layer, and then also the ability to look at what is built on top, and making sure that AI also, as we think about all the AI agents today that are built in the Web3 context, they can also have the infrastructure layer in a decentralized way.
I'm going to follow up on the use cases part. So historically, we've had a lot of data sets being onboarded as an archival use case. And then over time, retrieval also came into play. And then you also have compute over data, other use cases, AI enabled, and so on. How much of the uses today is still archival data, and how much is other services? Do you have some numbers in mind there?
So I don't have specific numbers for you, but I think like the real shift that we've seen is people building more services on top to complement the archival and sort of like the other types of use cases. So like Filecoin as a core protocol, all the verifiability and what sort of is the thing that people know it for with the proofs is happening at the archival layer. But the way that you can complement that is by slapping on like lighter incentives with hotter access data. So the way that you would use these two systems and the way that we see it happening in the wild is someone who's basically pinning IPFS data or saying, I'm going to pay someone to just like make this data available. You get way fewer guarantees from that, but then having at least one copy, if not multiple, in archival nodes, so you can rehydrate from there. And so you get then is super cheap storage, like on net from this bare metal provider who's offering you dramatically cheaper than the cloud. But then you have something that's like more optimistically serving on the more recurring basis, but then you can pull out if you ever need to from that archival source. I think like generally speaking though, on the network and its growth, the thing that we've actually seen also is just a shift towards where are the opportunities for compounding. So like one of the reasons that I think compute is really interesting, and especially for these teams that are focused on data pipelines, is each of those like raw data sets, if you land new sensor data or something of that nature, leads to a whole bunch of downstream data sets that just are sort of like person doing analysis A creates a new data set as a result of that. Someone wants to replicate that analysis and may create a derivative of that data set. And so you sort of see nonlinearity there. And I think we've seen some like couple point examples, but I think it's one of the more interesting themes as you see both the rise of decentralized compute along with the teams that are sort of like building the storage solutions to match.
Yeah, and I wanted to add one more example that matches actually archival with AI, because I know a lot of the themes for tomorrow's sessions are focused on AI in the space. So we have a great partner that is called Muckrock, and they actually archive a bunch of public records for U.S. government. And we're working with a company called Theoric, that's an decentralized AI agent, to actually make sense of data. So today, if you were to want to look up CIA data from the Muckrock archives, it would be really difficult to actually parse through that data and also make sense of it, and also make sure that hasn't been altered over time. And so you can imagine the archival layer having new capabilities when we can think about these strategic partnerships with different AI agents. So
But from all these examples, if you're looking at how you track the current adoption for Filecoin, what are some KPIs? What are some of the metrics that you look at the foundation just to assess the success of Filecoin?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that we like to think about for a healthy ecosystem, I wouldn't even say just for Filecoin, I would say in crypto in general, is really making sure we have a funnel for builders that are building at each stage. So we have a process where we can really reach out to early stage builders at hackathons that are interested in building on top of Filecoin, and also the different ecosystem companies like NFT.storage, Akave, all these companies that are right now coming. A lot of them are going to be announced quite soon, but making sure that we are getting new builders to engage and build. We also have a partnership with a number of accelerators that help funnel startups, later stage startups through the pipeline. And then finally, we have tons of companies that are now raising capital. And really, whether it's like JB said, launching an L2 on top of Filecoin, or whether they're trying to grow in a services way in a different direction, we want to be able to support and nurture that entire funnel. So I think a lot of the metrics is how many people at each stage are going through. And I think a lot of the more quantitative measurements that you've mentioned before are really just around how many new clients are coming into the network. A lot of the metrics that I think are not actually good metrics is, for a long time, we really focus on increasing storage capacity. But a lot of the players that came into Filecoin early on in the network, some of them were in it not necessarily for the right reasons. And so we did actually see a drop in total storage capacity because some of those entrants coming in didn't actually want to engage in storing real valuable data and also onboarding clients. So I do think looking at the right metrics are often really important because it's easy to go after the bigger numbers.
Maybe if I could add on a few things that I've personally been spending time like focused on, is more like ignoring sort of like builder's funnel and things like that, but even from just like what are the core things that make the economy run. So like if we look at what is the time for storage providers to be able to borrow capital as an example, that used to exist entirely off chain, and that could have been like a month-long underwriting process, versus with DeFi being able to do that instantaneously, but now being able to measure like what is the velocity at which you're seeing like miners being able to sign up, acquire the capital that they need, and so on. I think the same is actually also true on like the paid side of like how fast. And this is unfortunately not all on chain, so it's more just like me talking to a lot of teams. But the things that I care about are like how fast are those like business pipelines moving, and like how are they acquiring users? What's the enterprise sales cycle looking like? How is that improving over time? And I think over time, the thing that we really want to see is more and more of that move directly on chain. I think selling into Web2 enterprise, it's a really high bar to say like, hey, how am I going to get like, I don't know, Comcast or someone to like archive their data through an on-chain mechanism? But having teams that are building these on-ramps, we call them the L2s, as they build solutions, and they may have sort of like, I guess the equivalent of the storage mullet, like people talk about the DeFi mullet of like, here is a centralized API that you can use, but it backs it up and flows back on chain. And then those things progressively turning into protocols of their own. I think that's actually like the next phase of acceleration that we'll see, where it's like teams that are building hot storage layers that just kind of seamlessly do all the stuff. For a Web2 user, they may not even care. The thing that they care about is like cheaper cost. It's bare metal plus like some margin, not like, oh, I'm paying AWS bandwidth and pricing and things like that.
So you mentioned projects and teams building on Filecoin. We've got here a Filecoin ecosystem map. Clara, a question for you. What is the most promising vertical or the most promising area when you look at the ecosystem and say, here's where I think it's going to grow the most?
Yeah, I think it depends on what audience you're talking to. In an audience like here at Mainnet, we want to make sure that a lot of the Web3 companies, so JD just mentioned on-chain activity, which is something that we're constantly looking for. But one of the areas that we've also focused on this past year is looking at archiving the chain backup of different blockchains. An example is Solana. We backed up the ledger history of Solana in a project called Old Faithful. And that was a great partnership. But for a lot of crypto projects, I think Solana is around 518 terabytes of data. And they actually take up so much data to be able to even back up their chain activity. So I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of interest in different projects. Really want to make sure that their full stack is decentralized, not just at the top of the funnel. And then there's a couple of other verticals you can see on the screen here, anywhere from storage to DePIN to compute and AI, which JB mentioned. We have tons of companies that are really making sure that there's usable on-ramps. A lot of people say crypto is very difficult to use. So a lot of you guys might be familiar with NFT.storage that today works to archive and also back up. If you own an NFT, it's likely on IPFS and Filecoin. We're working with marketplaces like OpenSea and Rarible for more on the NFT side. And then we also have a number of companies building integrations like to make it as close as possible to Amazon S3, because the biggest competitors in our space are really traditional Web2 storage startups. We are the largest decentralized storage network out there, and a lot of what we're always thinking about is how do we make our user experience as close to Web2 so that when people have to migrate from AWS to thinking about a decentralized storage solution, they have the right on-ramps to get that ease, and they can also justify the egress fees that they may have to on-take. So I think those are huge verticals. DePIN is really interesting. We have a number of companies that are backing up onto Filecoin that are DePIN projects. One example is Weather Underground. They have weather stations all around the world. They actually deployed at the Paris Olympics and were able to help athletes there with local weather data, but they reward users on as accurate weather data they provide back to network. And that's all backed up on Filecoin. We have a ton of other DePIN projects like Akash or Aether around marketplaces for GPU that are looking at decentralized storage as an option that they can sit side by side for, and a lot of horizontal partnerships where we can also give them really great leads that might be good for their use cases. And then finally, DeFi, I think that you see a couple of use cases here. Secure finance. I don't know if JB, you wanted to jump into a couple more here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the thing I would say, I'll focus on two specific things. I think on DePIN, I think that's maybe too large of a term. It's like encompasses a lot. I think what I'm most interested in is that there's a growing category of protocols that own their own data assets. You can think of like the Hive mappers of the world. I was talking to a team that's working on a robotics protocol. And what's interesting to me is like, as many of these sensor-based networks generate like data, and their goal is to have a distributed set of users around the world, hopefully in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of users collecting data. They're typically talking about like petabyte scale data sets, which really aren't suited for the cloud or require a heavy dependency on one team to foot a large bill. And like, this is where having crypto native rails, having cloud scale infrastructure that is like tied to those crypto native rails is actually quite interesting, because you can build a full economy and say, I want to use the rewards for my protocol to literally pay for the services that my protocol runs. I don't need to have a team that's holding a bank account that's then paying the AWS bill. If that team goes bankrupt or has some sort of issue, the data set disappears. Like, we're actually getting to the world of like, this is all fully verifiable and like incentivizable from the chain itself. And kind of related to that is, I think there's a growing category of data chains. I've talked to a few teams. So there was the folks that ran the Reddit DAO as an example. And I think it's such a powerful use case of users taking their data out of a Web2 platform, being able to make that monetizable and saying, we're going to create a new data asset in the age of AI that allows AI companies to come license it. I think the thing that makes Filecoin quite interesting for some of those like use cases is there are certain types of data assets that you just can't create elsewhere. People talk about Google and Gemini having this huge advantage of having the YouTube data asset of 4 petabytes daily being uploaded. That actually can't exist outside of a Google scale platform. And the scale of the YouTube data that's being created is so enormous that no one other than Google could afford it. This is actually where Filecoin has a core advantage if you want to create a Sora-like model that doesn't rely on a Google. And so like, to me, this is where like, we're still early on some of these things, but you can like squint down the curve and see like, yes, we are on the right track for this stuff. And so then it's really about, can you build the right primitives to enable the use cases that you want afterwards?
So John, you mentioned the core advantage, and Clara, you also mentioned that the biggest competition for Filecoin is actually the traditional centralized cloud storage. So the question for you both is, in a world where the storage costs continue to go down, what is going to be the feature or what is going to be the aspect that is going to set apart Filecoin versus those traditional storage competitors?
Do you want to start? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so on the centralized side, I actually don't think it's Filecoin versus AWS or Google. I think at the limit, like the question is, when does AWS and Google determine that it's rational to participate in these open networks? I think that's like a very far future, but I don't think it's impossible. I think the right question for like Filecoin is like, can it create the software stack that's so good that it can run on anyone's commodity hardware that you can now aggregate the long tail of data centers that were going to get wiped out into one giant other bar? And if you've done that correctly, every marginal data center asks the question, do I want to be the smallest person competing with every other larger data center, or do I just become the biggest fish in a growing pool? And so like that is like how I think Filecoin eventually competes with like Google and all. But that's largely a bet on like you can create good enough open source software that can run on commodity hardware. And like all of that sort of happens. I think the other piece that sort of matters is the verifiability component. I think a lot of other systems that are designed are sort of based on trust in varying forms. I think if you actually want to build this open market of untrusting hardware, you do need verifiability as a core primitive inside of there. Verifiability has its own spectrum of like, do you get a snark every day that the data is there, or do you just trust that there's like an economically rational game that the data is maybe there? I think like you actually probably need all parts of that spectrum, where like some things you want to be cryptographically verifiable, some things you're fine with optimistic. I think it's more about like, do you have a pathway of actually covering the full spectrum? I think this is what makes some of Filecoin's approaches like kind of unique, where like the things that we have today with the archival side, I would say are at this very far end of like very slow, but very verifiable. And then you can layer on these like lighter proofs, things like proof of data possession, these like CDN networks that people are working on. And they'll give you different guarantees, but they'll also give you different performance characteristics, but it's all fully composable inside of the same ecosystem.
Yeah, so you mentioned the path towards covering a broad space. What's in store for Filecoin for the next 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to repeat a couple of points that JB made earlier around how we're thinking about key areas in the ecosystem to grow. The first one is really making sure we can have a huge pipeline of paid deals. And we're already doing that with a ton of companies you can see here that are actually going out and onboarding a ton of clients that are going to be paid users. There's also, JV just mentioned a little bit about a couple of areas where it's really unique, the crypto native use cases that really rethink the way even how traditional storage works. And so those are really areas where we're really excited about when we think about where are the paid users that have unique crypto native needs. The second area is really making sure that we can focus on services that make Filecoin indispensable. I think a lot of crypto right now is still smoke and mirrors. It's like if you don't have an NFT, life will go on. And for us, we're really making sure that everything that a user goes through as we are growing our client pipeline really does become indispensable, where retrievals are working, that we have a ton of paid users coming in, and also making sure that our entire ecosystem of startups building on it, they also can focus on the thing that they're trying to do. And I think the last piece is really just making sure that the whole ecosystem can work together. As you know, there's so many complicated parts. You've spent a lot of time studying the Filecoin ecosystem and making sure the right metrics are used to measure each component. But for us at the foundation, it's just making sure that everyone has what they need. Because if there's an imbalance, it becomes really difficult for one entity who's really good at doing one thing to do it well. JV, do you have more here?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the ecosystem writ large, it's hard to summarize and say like this is what's on the roadmap because there's so many teams working on different components of it. I would put maybe things into a few different buckets. There's some really interesting things just on like the cost reduction and optimizations for storage providers, things that make it easier for them to run their operations, things that make it cheaper for them to run their operations without sacrificing on the core properties of the network. I think those are big and important because they actually materially like change like the balance sheet in quotes for the ecosystem. There's teams that are working separate from that. There's teams that are working on like the top line side. I think this is where I would look at all the L2s, and I think they're taking pretty different approaches to either approaching Web2 customers or they're approaching like Web3 customers focused on specific use cases. Some are more focused on DeepIn, some on like AI and compute, things of that nature. I think those are interesting because it's taking basically like a market-based approach to like go to market, and we'll see different approaches. Hopefully some succeed, some do better than others. But it gives you like hopefully more optionality on like how does the ecosystem grow that like aggregate revenue coming in. I think related to that, actually, there's some interesting things in DeFi which are like kind of unique to Filecoin only that are happening, where teams that are working on stablecoins are doing it with an eye towards like, how do we use this for payment, not for anything like just purely speculative capital. And so that becomes interesting because you can always add the speculative use cases if you really want to, but it gives you this stable flow of demand from people who are literally just using it for settlement. And so having these native applications like storage or like the different classes of storage mean that you have this like very stable base of like buy pressure for those stable coins that can offset any sort of like fluctuations because someone who's trying to get like levered on ABC thing. And so I think to me that becomes really interesting because you can start now doing all of these Web2 businesses like reselling cash flows or like helping, basically like optimize how a miner actually runs their business because they literally are that. They are businesses, they are data centers, they're selling real services. You can just take the financial flows that would typically happen in Web2 off-chain and start moving them on-chain. So to me, that's like the other big category of interesting thing. One of my predictions is like for a lot of compute networks, because they're sort of in this weird in-between space of like optimistic versus verifiable compute, we're going to see actually more interplay between networks, where networks that want to do more optimistic compute jobs are going to start relying on verifiable work history. So you can use the fact that you're a Filecoin miner with an identity that has a bunch of proofs behind it to allow you to like take on more valuable jobs without having to like have that same job be done by 5 other people. This is a whole longer conversation that we should get into at some point. But I think like that sort of interplay between protocols, I think is going to be really interesting. And I've talked to a few teams that are actually trying to grapple with this problem because if you're a compute protocol trying to work in a silo, either you're going to spend a lot of money by having basically people do like cryptographic proofs of the data to say like, this is done correctly. I know that this miner hasn't like claimed to have done a compute job and not done it, or having 3 nodes do the same job 3 times. That's also not very efficient. So like being able to merge these things is only going to be possible if deepened networks work together. And so I've already had a few conversations with teams about this, and I think we'll see more of that in the future.
Yeah, and I did want to emphasize what JV said on on-chain activity and the new capabilities in Web3. Filecoin Virtual Machine launched last year on Pi Day. And we've had, I think, close to 3,200 smart contracts deployed so far, but we're seeing the huge swath of startups right now building on FEM and really unlocking all kinds of capabilities from data DAOs to new ways of compute and storage, all the way to other chains really looking at new capabilities we haven't even thought about before. But I did want to say that I think Filecoin is at a really interesting time right now. When I was just at Token 2049 2 weeks ago, a lot of people came up to me and it finally snapped in their head why storage is so important. I think storage is not the sexiest thing out there, but Filecoin has always been around since 2014. The white paper was announced in 2017. We've all been at work to really make decentralized storage at scale work, which is a really difficult challenge. And a lot of people right now thinking about DePIN, thinking about the buzzwords of AI, they forget that storage is that critical layer that you really need. And it's always easier to run to like the next buzzword in the crypto cycles. But we've been around for so long and people came up and said, I finally get why storage is so important. You have everything from looking at content integrity that decentralized storage really unlocks when you look at changes to file over time in a place where today most of the people on the web don't trust content online, and AI, there's even bigger distrust. I think the latest stat is like only 30 or 20 or 30% of people actually trust the contents of AI, and they want to look at the root of where a data source is coming from, how it's changed, and also making sure that it's not necessarily taken down by one government or censored in some way that's unknowing to them. So I think these general themes of also the general public waking up to understanding how their data is stored is going to be critical for more people understanding the complexities of what Filecoin can unlock. And that's also up to us to educate and help people understand what storage is, how it works, how different companies looking at storage today, how we're different, how data availability is different from Filecoin storage, right? So you hear about all these different ways of doing storage and making sure that people can understand the Filecoin narrative.
All right. Thank you so much. So waking up that data storage is so important, and it's the cornerstone for most of the businesses out there. I'd like you to thank you for the great discussion. And yeah, for our audience, in case you want to stay up to date with all of our research about decentralized storage and about Filecoin as well, go to messari.io/research. Thank you again.